Victor Hale, a freelance journalist seeking solace from the chaos of city life, had always been fascinated by old houses. Their history, their secrets, the stories the walls could tell. All of it felt like untapped potential for a man whose job was to uncover hidden truths. When he first set eyes on the Victorian house nestled deep in the countryside, surrounded by thick woods that seemed to close in on it like a protective barrier, he felt an inexplicable pull. It was as though the house itself beckoned him, whispering promises of peace and a fresh start. But what Victor didn't know was that this house had its own past, one that was far from peaceful. On the second night after moving in, Victor was exploring the dusty, forgotten corners of the place, driven by a journalist's curiosity. He found the house's original blueprint in the attic, yellowed and brittle with age. Something fell off. An entire section of the house was missing from the blueprint. It was as though a piece of the structure had been erased, and yet he could see no sign of it in the layout he knew. As he traced his fingers over the faded lines, his hand brushed against a loose floorboard beneath him, and that's when he heard it. A metallic clink, muffled but distinct. Heart pounding, Victor pried up the floorboard, revealing a small compartment hidden below. Inside, nestled in dust and cobwebs, lay an old, ornate key. It was larger than any key he'd seen, made of dark, tarnished metal that felt unnaturally cold to the touch, even in the warmth of the attic. There were strange engravings on its handle, symbols that he didn't recognize, but which gave him an uneasy feeling, like eyes staring back at him. Holding the key, Victor felt a shiver crawl up his spine, a chill that wasn't just from the cold metal. It felt alive, almost like the key itself had a pulse, faint and slow. He tried to shake off the feeling, but as the day turned into night, Victor found himself unable to ignore the key. He left it on the kitchen counter, but no matter how hard he tried to distract himself, his eyes kept drifting back to it. It sat there, innocuous, and yet it seemed to fill the entire room with its presence. The shadows in the house grew longer, darker, and Victor could swear he heard faint whispers, indistinct and distant, as though carried from another room or another time. It was as if the house had come alive, responding to the key's presence. By midnight, Victor couldn't take it anymore. He picked up the key again, the cold metal now almost burning against his skin, and he swore he felt something shift. A door somewhere deep in the house creaked, though he knew all the doors were closed and locked. The sound echoed, followed by a soft thud, like footsteps reverberating from within the walls. He was no longer alone, or perhaps he never had been. The house had secrets, and the key was only the beginning. Have you ever stumbled upon something that made you question the very fabric of your reality? Victor Hale, a man trying to escape his troubled past, thought he was starting fresh when he moved into an old Victorian house hidden deep in the woods. But one strange discovery changed everything. A key, cold and heavy, found buried beneath a loose floorboard. What secrets could it unlock, and why does it seem to carry a darkness all its own? Stick with us as we unravel the horrifying mystery that has engulfed Victor's life. If you enjoy stories filled with suspense and terror, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more chilling tales that keep you on the edge of your seat. The night Victor found the key, he couldn't sleep. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw it, engraved symbols dancing just behind his eyelids, as if branded into his mind. He tried to tell himself it was just his imagination, but the whispers began soon after midnight. Faint at first, almost like the rustling of the wind through the trees outside, but then they grew louder, more distinct, echoing from the darkened hallways of the house. Victor strained to listen, trying to make out words, but all he heard was a chorus of hushed voices overlapping, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. The house seemed to breathe with them, the creaks of the old wood shifting like ribs expanding and contracting. He could no longer ignore the pull of the key. Rising from his bed, Victor walked through the darkened corridors, the shadows seeming to lean towards him, guiding him. The air grew colder as he moved, his breath visible in front of him in misty puffs. He found himself standing in front of a door he hadn't noticed before, an ordinary-looking door in an otherwise familiar hallway. It was the kind of door you might overlook in a new house, thinking it led to a pantry or storage. But as Victor held the key closer, he felt the vibrations again, stronger this time, like a faint heartbeat that matched his own. The key slid into the lock with an unnatural smoothness, almost as if it were meant to be there, and with a slow turn, Victor heard the click. A sense of dread washed over him, a primal fear that seemed to scream at him to stop, to leave whatever lay beyond closed forever. But it was too late. The door swung open, revealing nothing but darkness, an impossible void that swallowed the light of the hallway. Victor hesitated. The cold air pouring from the doorway was filled with the unmistakable scent of damp earth and decay. A deep rumble came from within, like a distant growl of something waking up, something that had been dormant for far too long. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching him from within that darkness, pulling him in. The whispers returned, louder now, as though urging him to step through. His heart pounded in his chest, his instincts screaming danger, but he couldn't help but take one step forward, his foot disappearing into the blackness, the cold enveloping his skin like icy fingers. And then, just as quickly as they started, the whispers stopped. Silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. Victor pulled back, slamming the door shut, the key falling from the lock and clattering to the floor. He stumbled backward, breathing heavily, his skin covered in goosebumps. He turned, expecting to see the empty hallway, but something was different. The shadows had grown, twisted into shapes that didn't make sense. Dark, elongated figures that almost seemed to have form, a sense of presence. They were watching him. They had seen him open the door, and now they knew. Victor scrambled back to his bedroom, the key still lying on the hallway floor, but he felt as though he had brought something back with him. The walls of the house groaned, settling into an unfamiliar shape, and as he closed the bedroom door behind him, he knew that the safety he once felt in his new home had shattered. This was no longer just a quaint retreat. It was a trap, and he had just sprung it. If you think you have the courage to face what lies beyond, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Who knows, you might be the next one to hear those whispers. The first night after opening the mysterious door, Victor's sleep was restless and shallow, haunted by dreams that were far too vivid to dismiss as mere imagination. In the dream, he stood in the same hallway where he had found the door, but everything was wrong. The wallpaper was peeling, dark stains spread across the ceiling like a slow-growing infection, and the air was thick with an acrid stench, the kind that made his throat close up and his eyes water. He could feel the dampness of the floor under his bare feet, as though it were soaked with water or something else, something thicker. Victor began to walk down the hallway, each step echoing in a strange, distorted way, like the sound was being swallowed by something unseen. The house around him seemed to shift, the walls closing in, narrowing, and the ceiling dropping lower until he almost had to stoop. The shadows on the walls flickered as though cast by a fire, yet there was no source of light. Instead, a dim, pulsating glow seemed to emanate from beneath the doorways, a sickly greenish hue that made his skin crawl. He could hear whispers again, louder now, distinct but unintelligible, coming from behind each of those warped doors. The further he walked, the more he noticed how those whispers began to resemble something familiar, his own voice distorted, repeating words he couldn't quite make out. A sense of dread filled him as he approached the end of the hallway, where the mysterious door stood slightly ajar. The wood was splintered, as if something had forced it open from the other side. Victor hesitated, his hand reaching for the doorknob, and as his fingers made contact, the metal seemed to pulse under his touch, as if alive. Suddenly, the door flew open, and he was pulled inside by an unseen force. Victor found himself in a vast, cavernous space that shouldn't have existed within the confines of his house. It was like an attic, but stretched infinitely, filled with a thick, swirling fog that obscured anything more than a few feet ahead. He could barely see, but he could sense movement, something shifting just out of sight, sliding across the floor. The sound of it was wet and heavy, like flesh dragging against wood. He felt a chill seep into his bones, a deep, primal fear that told him he was not alone. Victor strained his ears, trying to catch any sign of what was with him, but the fog only thickened, muffling sound. Then, he heard it. Breathing, deep, labored, like whatever it was had been waiting for far too long. It echoed around him, coming from all directions, and Victor spun, trying to locate the source. But every time he thought he found it, it shifted, always behind him, always out of reach. The whispers returned, louder now, and he could finally make out the words. They were calling his name, over and over, in a voice that sounded like his own but twisted, as if spoken through clenched teeth. The fog parted for just a moment, revealing a figure standing at the edge of his vision, a shadowy silhouette that mirrored his own stance, its head tilted in a grotesque, unnatural angle. It raised a hand, pointing at him, and Victor felt an icy grip around his chest, tightening, squeezing the air out of his lungs. He tried to move, to scream, but his body wouldn't respond. The walls around him began to shift, the very fabric of the room bending and warping, as though the house was breathing, an enormous, living thing, and he was caught inside. Victor jolted awake, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding as if it would burst from his chest. The room was dark, silent, but something was wrong. The air felt thick, heavy, and the shadows seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. He reached for the lamp on his bedside table, his hands trembling, and as the light flickered on, he saw it. The key, lying on the floor at the foot of his bed, just where he hadn't left it. It was glowing faintly, the symbols almost writhing alive. Victor stared at it, the memory of the figure in the fog still fresh in his mind. The sense of familiarity from the dream was undeniable, but it was laced with something else now. Fear, deep and gnawing. He could no longer tell where the dream ended and reality began, and the key was at the center of it all. As he picked it up, a chill ran through his body, and he knew this was just the beginning. The door was still there, waiting, and something on the other side was calling to him. Victor found himself standing once again in the shadow-choked hallway of his house, though this time it was unmistakably different. The air was dense, almost viscous, as if he were moving through water, and an unnatural silence pressed down on everything, so deep it felt like his ears were about to burst. The door was there at the end of the corridor, slightly ajar, with the same sickly green light spilling from the crack, illuminating the floor in a sinister glow. It beckoned him, a whispering call that resonated deep within his chest, urging him to move forward, to open it, to see what lay beyond. As Victor approached, each step seemed to echo unnaturally, the sound stretching out like a distorted recording. The floor beneath his feet shifted, soft and spongy, and with every step, he could feel it sagging, as if something beneath the floorboards moved along with him. A rotten smell of mildew and decay intensified, assaulting his senses and making his stomach churn. His hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob again, feeling its icy coldness that seemed to drain the warmth from his skin. He pushed the door open, and the hinges groaned like a wounded animal, a sound that echoed down the hallway, swallowed by the oppressive silence. The space beyond the door was the same vast, fog-filled void from his previous dream, but now it was different, more alive. The fog twisted and coiled like a living entity, and Victor could see shapes moving within it, flickering just beyond the edges of his vision. He stepped forward, drawn in despite every instinct screaming for him to turn back. As soon as both his feet crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening finality, the sound reverberating like a thunderclap, making him jump. Panic gripped him as he turned, only to find that the door had vanished, replaced by an endless wall of pulsating fog. Suddenly, the ground beneath him gave way. Victor fell, his stomach lurching as he plunged into darkness, the world spinning out of control. He hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs, and he lay there, gasping, his vision blurred. As he struggled to his feet, Victor realized he was no longer in the fog. Instead, he was standing in the middle of a twisted version of his own living room, but everything was wrong. The walls were covered in dark, wet stains. The furniture warped and decayed, and the windows looked out onto nothing but black void. There was no light, save for the dim, pulsating glow emanating from the center of the room, a glow that came from a shadowy figure standing there. The figure was facing away from him, its form hunched and gaunt, as if it were starving or in pain. It was draped in tattered, shadowy robes that seemed to move on their own, writhing as though alive. Victor's breath caught in his throat as the figure began to turn, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being forced by unseen strings. When it finally faced him, Victor's blood ran cold. The figure's face was obscured, a dark void where its features should have been, but he could see his own reflection within that darkness, his own face, twisted in fear, staring back at him. Victor felt a pull, a force dragging him toward the figure, and the whispers began again, louder, echoing in his mind, growing more intense with every second. The figure raised a hand, its bony fingers outstretched, and Victor felt his body move against his will, his feet shuffling forward, drawn closer and closer to that void. Panic set in, and he fought against the force, every muscle straining as he tried to break free. But it was useless. The figure's presence was overwhelming, an oppressive weight pressing down on him, crushing his will. Just when it seemed like he would be swallowed by the void, a sharp, blinding pain shot through his hand. Victor looked down and saw the key. It was glowing, burning hot, searing his palm. But it was enough. The pain snapped him back to his senses, and with a desperate cry, he yanked his hand away, clutching the key tightly. The figure let out a sound, something between a growl and a scream, that reverberated through the room, shaking the walls, and the darkness began to recede, pulling away like a retreating tide. Suddenly, Victor was no longer in the twisted living room. He was back in his own bed, drenched in sweat, the key still clenched in his hand, its metal cool against his skin once more. He sat up, gasping for breath, his heart pounding as he looked around the room. Everything seemed normal, but the echoes of that other place still lingered. He could feel it in the shadows, in the silence that pressed in around him. And as his eyes fell on the key, lying innocently in his palm, he realized that whatever had happened, whatever he had faced, it wasn't over. He had brought something back with him, and it was waiting, just beyond the edges of his reality, ready to return. Victor awoke to a morning that felt wrong, though everything seemed, at first glance, to be in its proper place. The familiar golden light of dawn filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow across his room. But the warmth was superficial. He felt an unshakable chill deep inside him, as if a part of the cold from the other side had taken root in his bones. The key lay on his bedside table, its dull metal glinting in the morning light, but there was something different about it. The engravings on its surface seemed deeper, as if the symbols had been freshly etched. When he picked it up, a shiver ran through his hand, an unpleasant reminder of the burning pain he had felt in the dream. Victor knew he couldn't ignore the key any longer. He needed answers, and he needed to understand what was happening. He spent the day researching the history of his house, poring over old records and archives, searching for anything that could explain the strange occurrences. The library was a place of refuge for him, a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere of his home. Dusty books and forgotten documents were spread before him, and as he scanned each page, a pattern began to emerge, an unsettling story that pointed to something far darker than he could have imagined. He found a newspaper article from the 1950s that spoke of a disappearance. A previous owner of the house, a man named Elias Wren, who had vanished without a trace. The article described how Elias had become obsessed with a key he'd found in the house, a key he believed could open a gateway to another realm. Neighbors had spoken of strange lights emanating from the attic at night, and had heard sounds, inhuman, guttural noises, that no one could explain. The more Victor read, the more he realized he was following in the footsteps of Elias, and that realization filled him with a deep sense of dread. Was he destined to meet the same fate? When Victor returned home, he felt the weight of the house pressing down on him more heavily than ever before. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the shadows seemed to be watching him, shifting subtly as he moved. He couldn't shake the feeling that the house was aware of him, that it had always been aware, and that it had been waiting for someone like him to arrive. Clutching the key, he made his way to the attic, driven by a compulsion he no longer understood, but couldn't resist. The door to the attic was ajar, the same as it had been in his dreams, and as he ascended the stairs, the temperature dropped with each step, the warmth of the day disappearing into an icy void. The attic was just as he remembered, dusty, cluttered, and filled with forgotten relics of the past. But there was something else now, something that hadn't been there before. In the corner, almost hidden beneath a stack of old boxes, he saw it. A journal, its leather cover cracked and worn, as if it had been there for decades. Victor knelt down, his hands trembling as he reached for it. The moment he touched the journal, he felt it, a connection, a rush of images flooding his mind. He saw Elias Wren, sitting in the same attic, his eyes wide with terror as he clutched the key, the same key that Victor now held. He saw flashes of the void, the dark figure reaching out, and the feeling of being pulled into that cold, endless abyss. Victor opened the journal, the pages brittle and yellowed with age. The entries were erratic, the handwriting shaky and desperate. Elias wrote of the key, of how it had appeared to him, of the dreams that had haunted him, and of the door that led to somewhere else, somewhere that defied all understanding. He wrote of voices that whispered to him, promising knowledge, power, but also of the price that must be paid. The final entry was unfinished, the ink smeared, as if Elias had been interrupted mid-sentence. It spoke of the guardian, the figure in the fog, and the realization that the key was not just a key. It was an invitation, a lure meant to draw someone in, to feed the darkness on the other side. Victor's breath caught in his throat as he read the last words, barely legible. The key is not mine. It belongs to the abyss. It wants me, and it will take me, just as it took the others. He looked down at the key in his hand, the metal now warm, almost pulsing, as if alive. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The key had a purpose, and it had chosen him. The darkness was not done, and it was only a matter of time before it came to claim him, just as it had claimed Elias. Suddenly, a noise echoed through the attic, a soft creaking that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Victor's head snapped up, his heart pounding in his chest. The shadows shifted, and for the briefest moment he saw them. Figures moving just beyond the edge of his vision, their forms twisted and unnatural. The whispers returned louder now, echoing through the attic, and Victor realized with a cold, dawning horror that he was not alone. The house was alive, and it was watching him. The key slipped from his fingers, clattering to the floor, and the whispers grew into a chorus of mocking laughter, filling the attic with a sound that was both human and not, a sound that promised only one thing: his time was running out. Victor knew he could not endure this alone any longer. The house, the key, the nightmares, it was all spiraling out of control, and he felt as though he was being pulled deeper and deeper into an inescapable darkness. Desperation gnawed at him, driving him to seek answers beyond dusty records and faded journals. He needed someone who could understand, someone who could help him before the abyss claimed him entirely. After scouring the town for leads, he found her, a reclusive old woman named Agatha, who lived on the outskirts, known for her knowledge of the occult and the strange history of the region. Agatha's house was as peculiar as she was, filled with the scent of dried herbs, talismans hanging from the ceiling, and candles flickering in every corner, casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. She eyed Victor with a mix of curiosity and caution, as if she could sense the darkness clinging to him the moment he stepped through her door. Victor wasted no time explaining what he had experienced: the key, the door, the otherworldly figure. The whole story spilled out of him, each word laced with fear and urgency. Agatha listened in silence, her expression growing more serious with every detail he recounted. When he finished, Agatha nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing as she spoke. "The key you describe, it's not just any key. It's a conduit, a link between this world and the one beyond, the one that feeds on fear, on despair." She gestured for Victor to follow her to a dusty shelf filled with old tomes, and she pulled one down, the leather cover cracked with age. Flipping through the pages, she showed him an illustration, a key almost identical to his, with the same strange symbols etched into the metal. "This is the key of the abyss," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It chooses its keeper, drawing them in until they are consumed by the void. It is a test, a lure, and very few escape its grasp." Victor felt a chill settle into his bones. "But why me?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Why this house? What does it want from me?" Agatha looked at him with pity. "The abyss has no reason that we can understand. It seeks to break those who are vulnerable, those who are already standing at the edge. The key found you because it sensed your need, your weakness. And now, it won't let you go without a fight." Victor's stomach twisted at her words. He thought of all the moments in his life that had led him here, his failed career in the city, the collapse of his relationships, his desperate need for a new beginning. The house had seemed like a refuge, but it was nothing more than a trap, one he had willingly walked into. Agatha placed a hand on his arm, her grip surprisingly firm. "There is a way," she said, her eyes locking onto his. "You must face it. You must confront whatever lies on the other side of that door. Only then can you sever the connection. But be warned, once you enter, the abyss will do everything in its power to keep you." The thought of returning to that twisted version of his house filled Victor with dread, but he knew he had no choice. He could already feel the shadows closing in, could hear the whispers in the back of his mind, growing louder with each passing day. That night, Victor returned home, the key cold in his pocket, its weight a constant reminder of what awaited him. He moved through the darkened halls, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. The house felt more alive than ever, as though it were watching his every move, waiting for him to make the next step. As he approached the attic stairs, the temperature dropped sharply, his breath misting in front of him. The door to the attic was open, the darkness beyond it yawning like the maw of some great beast. Victor hesitated, fear clawing at his insides, but he forced himself forward. The steps creaked under his weight, each one echoing like a death knell, and when he reached the top, the door to the otherworldly room stood before him once again, its surface pulsing faintly, like a heartbeat. Victor pulled the key from his pocket, his hand trembling as he fitted into the lock. The moment the key turned, a rush of cold air burst from the room, nearly knocking him off his feet. He stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind him, plunging him into darkness. The fog was there, thick and choking, and Victor could feel the presence in the room with him, the guardian of the abyss. It was close, closer than ever, and he could hear its labored breathing, feel its eyes on him. Suddenly, the fog parted, and Victor found himself face to face with the figure from his dreams. Its form was clearer now, tall, gaunt, its face a dark void that seemed to swallow the light around it. It raised a hand, pointing at Victor, and he felt the cold grip of the abyss around his heart, squeezing, pulling him forward. Agatha's words echoed in his mind. He had to face it, to confront it. Summoning every ounce of strength, Victor took a step toward the figure, then another, his fear turning into something else, anger, determination. He would not be consumed. He would not be taken. The figure let out a sound, a guttural, inhuman noise that reverberated through the room, and suddenly, the ground beneath Victor began to shift, the floorboards cracking, giving way to the darkness below. He could feel the pull of the void, a force that wanted to drag him down, to make him disappear forever. But Victor held his ground, the key burning hot in his hand, and with a shout, he drove it forward into the heart of the shadowy figure. The world exploded in a burst of light and sound, the darkness recoiling, the whispers turning into a deafening scream. And then, silence. Victor was standing in the attic once more, the key still in his hand, the air still and quiet. The door before him was gone, replaced by a blank wall, as though it had never existed. He dropped to his knees, his body trembling, the weight of what he had just faced pressing down on him. The key lay in his hand, its surface now smooth, the engravings gone, the coldness dissipating. He had confronted the abyss, and he had survived. But as Victor looked around the attic, the shadows still seemed to watch him, and he knew this wasn't over. The abyss had let him go, but it had not forgotten him, and it never would. Victor knew he had only bought himself time. The presence in his house had receded, but he could still feel its eyes on him, lurking just out of sight, waiting. Days passed, and though the oppressive atmosphere in the house had lightened slightly, the whispers never truly left. They followed him through every corridor, whispered from behind every door. He knew he couldn't keep running from the darkness. He had to face it head-on, to find the source and end it once and for all. The night of the confrontation began like the others, with a chill in the air and the feeling of being watched. Victor had prepared himself, lighting candles throughout the house, placing salt along the thresholds, hoping to create some barrier between himself and whatever dwelled beyond. He knew these precautions were mostly symbolic, but they gave him a sense of control, a feeling that he wasn't completely powerless. Agatha had warned him that the abyss would not let go easily and that it would fight to keep what it claimed. As midnight approached, the house seemed to shift around him. The walls groaned as if alive. The floorboards creaked under an unseen weight, and the shadows twisted into grotesque shapes. Victor stood in the hallway, the key clutched tightly in his hand, feeling the cold metal throb as though it had a pulse of its own. Suddenly, a sound echoed from above, a low, resonant creak that seemed to come from the attic. The door to the attic, which had been sealed since the night he confronted the void, was now wide open, darkness spilling from it like ink. Victor's heart pounded as he climbed the stairs, each step heavier than the last, his body fighting against the invisible pressure pushing down on him. The air grew colder with each step, his breath visible in the dim light of the flickering candle he held. When he reached the top, the attic stretched before him, an impossible space that seemed to go on forever, filled with shifting fog and dark silhouettes. The door that had disappeared had returned, standing at the far end, the greenish glow seeping from its edges, calling to him. He stepped into the attic, and the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening crash, the candle flickering out, plunging him into darkness. Victor's breath came in short gasps as he fumbled for the key, its cold surface the only thing grounding him in that moment. The whispers returned, louder than ever, echoing around him, overlapping, growing into a cacophony of sound that filled his mind, drowning out all thought. He could hear his name, repeated over and over, voices that sounded like his own but twisted, filled with malice. As he moved closer to the glowing door, Victor could see the figure waiting for him, the guardian of the abyss, standing still in the center of the fog, its dark, featureless face watching him. It raised a hand, and Victor felt the pull, the overwhelming force, trying to drag him forward, trying to make him kneel. The key burned in his hand, and he knew this was the moment, the final confrontation. He had to face it, to fight it, or be lost forever. Victor summoned all his courage, holding the key before him like a weapon. The whispers grew deafening, the shadows pressing in on him, and he felt the ground shift beneath his feet, the void opening up, trying to swallow him. The guardian moved toward him, its body a mass of shifting shadows, its form blurring and twisting, growing larger, more imposing. It reached for him, its hand a mass of darkness, and Victor felt the chill of the abyss seep into his skin, freezing him in place. With a desperate cry, Victor lunged forward, plunging the key into the center of the figure's chest. For a moment, everything was still. The whispers stopped, the shadows froze, and the entire world seemed to hold its breath. Then, the figure let out a sound, a low, guttural scream that shook the attic, reverberating through the walls, the very foundation of the house. The darkness recoiled, the fog swirling violently, as if caught in a storm, and the ground beneath Victor's feet began to crumble, pieces of the floor falling away into the void below. The figure twisted, writhing in pain, the darkness peeling away from it, and for the briefest moment, Victor saw what lay beneath. The face of Elias Wren, his eyes wide with terror, his mouth open in a silent scream, his hands reaching out as if to pull Victor down with him. But Victor held his ground, the key glowing bright, burning with a light that seemed to push the darkness back, inch by inch. The void screamed, the shadows convulsing, and then, in a blinding flash of light, everything was gone. Victor found himself on the floor of his attic, the key still in his hand, the air still and silent. The fog had lifted, the oppressive presence gone, but the echoes of the abyss still lingered, a faint whisper in the back of his mind. He looked around, the attic now just a room, dusty, cluttered, filled with forgotten memories. The door that had led to the otherworldly space was gone, replaced by a blank wall, and Victor felt a sense of relief wash over him, though it was tinged with the knowledge that the abyss was not truly defeated. It had retreated, but it had not forgotten. As Victor stood, his legs unsteady, he looked down at the key in his hand. The symbols had faded, the metal warm, almost comforting. He knew he had won this battle, but the war was far from over. The darkness was still there, waiting, watching, and he would have to remain vigilant. He left the attic, closing the door behind him, the weight of what he had faced pressing down on him. The house was quiet now, but was a quiet that held secrets, a silence that promised that one day the abyss would call to him again. And when it did, he would be ready. Victor tried to resume his life after the confrontation, but the house no longer felt like a home. Though the door to the abyss had vanished, the memories of what he had faced lingered in every corner, every shadow. There was an uneasy silence that filled the rooms, an absence of something he couldn't quite name. He could walk from room to room in the daylight, but he always felt that same subtle pressure, like the air was denser, waiting, hiding secrets that refused to reveal themselves. Every night, the temperature would drop inexplicably, and though Victor told himself it was only his imagination, he could never shake the feeling that something was still there, watching from the dark. It wasn't just the house. The key had changed too. Where once it had been a heavy, cold piece of metal, now it seemed lighter, almost ordinary. The strange engravings had faded, and if anyone else had looked at it, they might have mistaken it for a mundane antique. But to Victor, the key was anything but normal. He could still feel a faint energy whenever he held it, a connection that refused to break. He kept it locked away in a drawer, but every night he would hear it, an almost imperceptible sound, a whisper that called to him from the depths of the darkness. One night, he awoke to find the key no longer in the drawer where he had left it. Instead, it was lying on his pillow, the metal glinting faintly in the moonlight. His heart pounded, fear clawing at his chest as he picked it up, feeling the warmth radiating from it. The symbols had returned, faint but unmistakable, and as Victor stared at them, he felt the pull once again, the abyss reaching out, calling him back. He knew then that whatever he had done, whatever battle he had fought, it had not been enough. The connection to the other side still remained, an invisible thread that bound him to the darkness. Victor decided he had to leave. The house was a trap, a gateway that could never truly be closed. He packed his belongings, leaving behind anything that tied him to that place. But as he stepped out the front door for the last time, he felt a pang of doubt. Could he really escape it? Could he ever be free of the abyss? Or was it already too late? He closed the door behind him, the sound echoing in the stillness, and walked away, never looking back. But as he reached the edge of the property, he hesitated. In his pocket, the key felt heavier, almost as if it were anchoring him to the ground, unwilling to let him leave. That night, Victor checked into a motel far from the house, hoping for a peaceful sleep. He placed the key on the nightstand, watching it closely, half expecting it to disappear or move on its own. The room was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that felt unnatural, the air thick with anticipation. As he finally drifted off, Victor found himself in a familiar place, standing in the hallway of his old house, the door to the attic wide open, the greenish light spilling out, beckoning him forward. He felt the pull stronger than ever, and as he stepped toward the door, the whispers began again, a cacophony of voices calling his name, laughing, taunting. Victor awoke with a start, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding. The key was still on the nightstand, but now it was glowing faintly, the symbols shifting, writhing, almost alive. He realized, with a growing sense of dread, that the abyss was not bound to the house. It was bound to him. The key was a part of him now, and no matter where he went, the darkness would follow. He could run, he could hide, but the whispers would always find him. The door would always be waiting. The next day, Victor found himself standing at a crossroads. He could continue to flee, hoping against hope that he could outrun the abyss, or he could face it once more, find a way to break the connection, to sever the bond for good. But how? The figure in the fog, the guardian, had been only one aspect of the abyss. There were more secrets, more shadows that lay beyond, waiting for him to stumble, to fall. The key was a challenge, an invitation, and Victor knew that until he found a way to end it, the door would never truly be closed. If you've ever felt that chill in the dead of night, if you've ever heard whispers in the darkness that you couldn't quite explain, perhaps you too have felt the touch of the abyss. What would you do in Victor's place? Would you keep running, or would you confront the darkness head-on, knowing that it might mean losing everything? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to hear more stories like this, of doors that should never be opened, of secrets that should remain buried, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. After all, we all have our keys, and sometimes they open doors to places we never imagined.